Welcome back to the Daily Items, ongoing conversations with political candidates for office and for the November 6th general election. This afternoon, we're joined by Denny Wolff, the Democrat in the running for U.S. House in the 9th District, the newly formed 9th District. Thanks for coming, Mr. Wolff.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's start out with a couple things, issues that are in the news right now. Let's start with the caravan coming from South America. How do you think we're handling it in advance of this? And it sort of leads into your stance on the immigration policies, which we see now with DACA, the Dreamers, and things like that.
Sure. Well, I know the immigration parade that is taking place is something that's created a lot of attention, a lot of national news covering it. I know there's some accurate information and some inaccurate information out there about the people that are making that journey. I mean, I think we have to look at this from the standpoint that it happens every year. There is a system in place for people that are looking for asylum in the United States. They are coming there. They will go through the process, and they will be detained and be vetted, and the decision will be made. So it's the process that this country has had. It's been in place for a long time, and I think it works.
What do you think about President Trump's continued promise to build the wall on the southern border? Are you in favor of that? His policy there?
Well, let me start out by saying that I think border security is the #1 issue when it comes to national security. We need to have secure borders. But looking at the price tag that's on that, and looking at some of the information that comes out of folks like the DEA or the Border Patrol, Border Security Patrol, they think that the wall may not be the best way to keep people out. They think that new technology could be incorporated into keeping people back from the wall, protecting our borders on the southern side. And they think that things like towers with cameras work. They think that ground sensors work, and they think that putting a wall in there would be using 14th century technology to solve a 21st century problem. So with that, and the projected costs, that ranges anywhere from $50 to $70 billion, with hundreds of millions of dollars a year in maintenance on that wall. I guess I'm too conservative to say I think that's a good idea. I think we need to listen to the DEA. I think we need to listen to the Border Patrol folks and see what their suggestions may be. I think if people in D.C. are sitting around a table with pinstripe suits on making that decision, that may not be the best decision. So I think we need to rely on the people that are there and live it every day.
So you talk about the caravan coming from Central America, that they come across legally. What do you do with the people who are already here in the country, dreamers, those who came when they were little children, had nothing to do with breaking the law to get here?
Well, when you look at the number of illegal residents in this country, it's a lot. It's an estimate, of course, because we don't know. Some people think it's 10 million. Some people think it's 15 million. So it's many people. Look, it's a problem that we need to deal with. It's been here for a while. It's been a problem that has been kicked down the road many times. On the options of how you solve that problem, one thing that's not on that list is deporting 11+ million people. It's not financially possible. It's not physically possible. It will be like deporting everybody that lives in Pennsylvania, practically. So you need to say, okay, we have a lot of people here, many people here that are not documented. We need to put in place a system to register those people. And I'm not talking about offering them amnesty. I'm not talking about giving them citizenship. I'm talking about giving them a visa. Something that we now have them in the system, we know who they are, and they are here with a visa. We can vet them, we can do background checks, we can see if they owe back taxes, we can see if they have criminal records, and if they have a criminal record, of course, they get deported. So the idea is that we need to bring them into the system and then go from there.
How do you monitor the visa system on the back end? Because one of the things that we've seen is we have people that simply overstay their visas.
Well,
they come here legally and then simply overstay them.
Sure. Most of the people that are here have come into this country with a visa and overstayed their visa. So, I mean, I think E-Verify is a good way to look at that. I know the visa system is not a system that is looked at by many parts of society and or businesses as a good, effective way to bring people into the country, especially from the standpoint of seasonal workers. The H-2A program, I know a lot of farmers that rely on H-2A workers. They are not growing the same crops as they used to. Maybe they used to grow tomatoes or crops that required seasonal workers to come in and harvest their crop in the fall. They don't do that anymore because they say the H-2A program is too bureaucratic, it's too expensive, and it's not dependable. So that needs to change, as well as I know that the last piece of legislation that was considered had an H2C program. It was a program where workers could come in for a longer period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years. And then if they have a good track record and they've been, good workers, they could have that renewed. So I know that's something that's very interested, that particularly livestock agriculture is interested in, and the food processing part of agriculture. They're very interested in seeing that kind of a visa program put in place.
Okay, Mr. Wolff, speaking of farmers, what are you hearing from that community about the tariffs that have been imposed in recent months?
Well, I served on the World Trade Organization, so I understand that the difference between trade agreements and trade deficit, and some people seem to have a real problem with that. Trade agreements are put in between two governments. They are rules and regulations that they're following. Sometimes they protect certain crops or products as it relates to agriculture. And of course, there's standards in there in terms of labor, environmental issues. So trade agreements encompass many different issues that need to be resolved, and they take years to develop. So once they're in place, you may want to critique them, you may need to work on them, you may need to rewrite them and update them. I think that makes sense. But a lot of the discussion has been about our trade deficit. Trade deficit is not created by trade agreements. Trade deficits are created by people. Trade deficits don't happen between Beijing and Washington, D.C. They happen because people go to Walmart and they decide to buy a cheaper product, even if it was made in China, instead of buying one that's made in the United States of America. They will buy a product that is cheaper, maybe a couple $100 less for a TV, for example. So I think we need to keep those two things in different compartments, and we need to understand that trade agreements are necessary. They're important. We have tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers and agreements that have been placed for a long time, and I agree. They need to be renegotiated. I think renegotiating NAFTA is a good idea. I think it should be modernized. I think that part of the discussion was good. When we put tariffs on steel and aluminum coming in from Canada because of national security, look, I'm just a farmer, but that doesn't pass the common sense test for me. That doesn't make much sense. So I think that was brought into the discussion. That has created a lot of problems for agriculture, other industries, but agriculture in particular, because they felt the reaction immediately, especially the dairy industry, because the dairy industry sells product every day. They get paid every month. They're not like the soybean producer that has a bin full of soybeans and can maybe wait it out or try to decide how they're going to handle the lower prices that have taken place. Now, of course, they're up against it now also, because harvest is here, their bin's full, so they're going to sell them at under $8 a bushel, when it was $11 before the trade war started. So they're the real life issues that farmers are facing out there. As we're sitting here talking about this today, there are farm families sitting around the kitchen table in the United States that are making decisions whether they're going to keep their farm or sell it, because their line of credits have been exhausted. They are trying to decide what it looks like in the future. Is there hope? And unfortunately, with the way that the trade agreements, with the tariff war that's ongoing, they really don't see an end to it. So it needs to be resolved. The sooner the better. Hey, we are where we are today. So it's about how do you solve this problem going forward. It's not about looking back and saying this wasn't maybe a good idea. It is that's in a rearview mirror. Here's where we are. We need to make sure that we put in place trade agreements that make sense and move it forward, and in particular, China.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to healthcare, if you would. Of course, right now, it seems like every time I turn around, I'm hearing somebody talking about pre-existing conditions and the concerns over whether that will remain a viable part of our healthcare situation here in the United States. There's obviously a lawsuit going on in Texas that would rule on the constitutionality of the entire Affordable Care Act, and there's also various votes that have been held to try to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. Where do you stand on that, and this particularly on this issue of pre-existing conditions?
Well, look, my youngest son was born with biliary atresia, so I understand what it's like to have a member of the family that has a condition that would really be a huge challenge for someone going forward in terms of trying to get health care. So pre-existing conditions need to be covered. There's no question about it. So that part needs to be part of whatever program we have going forward. And there's some other parts that worked. I mean, I think allowing family members to stay on until they're 26 years old, I think that's a good idea. It kind of gives them an interim in there when they get out of college until they get their feet on the ground. But when you look at the healthcare system and the challenges and problems that we have, there's three components to it. The first is that the healthcare providers, healthcare in this country is extremely expensive. It is twice as much as it is in any other developed country in the world. That's a problem. So we need to figure out how we're going to deal with that. And there's many thoughts on that, but certainly the administrative costs of healthcare in this country is way out of line. The example that I like to use is Duke University Medical Center has 900 doctors and they have 1,300 billing clerks. That tells you how complicated and how complex both the services that they're offering and how they code them, as well as the different insurance companies, Medicare, Medicaid, what the copay is, what the deductible is, and that battle goes on forever and ever. They estimate that that adds 15% onto your bill right out of the chute. And then tests that should not maybe be administered immediately. For example, maybe an MRI would be something you would do after you tried and looked at some other tests to see whether that was required. So sometimes I know in talking to the people at Geisinger, they told me that 33% of the tests that are performed are probably not required. It's just the way it is. Sometimes doctors do that simply to make sure that they can get everything done at one visit, and I understand that and appreciate that, but it puts a really large price tag to your visit to the doctor's office. And of course the other part is prescription drugs. Big problem. 10 times the rate of inflation in the last 5 years is how prescription drugs have increased. So that is at the heart of the problem. Our healthcare delivery system is expensive and our drugs are expensive. Now we have to figure out how we're going to write insurance policies that are reasonable to cover that. And that's where you get into a real challenge.
Well, of course, the Republicans campaigned in the 2016 presidential election on repealing and replacing Obamacare, as they call it. And while they've chipped away at the Affordable Care Act, there has been no real replacement. Do you have specific ideas as to what we could do to fix what's wrong with the Affordable Care Act?
Whatever it is called, or however you do it, we need to be able to control and encourage an improvement of efficiency of the healthcare delivery system. And we also need to bring the price of drugs down. And some people feel that comes through transparency. I've read some articles that says, capitalism doesn't work very well in the pharmaceutical industry. It's out of control. Prices are extremely high. There needs to be transparency there to see actually what the cost of producing those drugs may be. So we need to bring those prices down. We need to incentivize more people to have health insurance, because right now the group of people that has health insurance are people that need health insurance. People with pre-existing conditions, senior citizens, and the younger healthy part of society, they're taking a pass on it because it's expensive. So you're insuring high-risk people, you have a healthcare delivery system that is extremely expensive, and then you have an insurance company in the middle that's trying to write premiums that justify that imbalance. So we need to have more people insured, we need to incentivize that, we need to put in place programs where senior citizens do preventative care. For example, whether it's exercise, diet, getting a flu shot, there's many things that you can do in terms of how a person's lifestyles translate into their need for medical care.
So how would you incentivize a young person to pay for health care?
Well, I think once you have everybody under the umbrella, the price comes down. I mean, the reason that the prices are sky high right now is younger people are not buying health insurance. So if you have the price that's more reasonable, if you have the healthcare delivery system that can contain prices and bring that price down, and you get your prescription drugs under control and bring that down, then health insurance is more affordable. You have more people under the umbrella and it works better, more efficiently, just like any insurance policy would be. I've served on the board of 2 insurance companies, so I know the concept of how important your quality of your book of business is as it relates to the premiums that you're writing and your claims. That all fits together and flows together. It all makes sense. And it's the same problem that we have in the healthcare system right now. We have a very expensive healthcare delivery system, and we have a high-risk group of people that have insurance. That translates into extremely high premiums. So somehow those three parts have to fit together, and that needs to be part of the discussion and part of the new bill, whatever they call it. You can call it whatever. You can say repeal and replace. You can say repeal. You can say whatever you want to say. But we need a health care system that's based on some of the good things that have been part of the Affordable Care Act, and then go forward.
Is Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All a possibility?
It's not at the top of my list for sure. I would like to see if the private industry can get this thing figured out. And if they can, it's certainly a discussion we could have in the future. But right now, I feel strongly that we need to see if we can get this figured out and get the three parts of this equation working where it is in private practice.
Okay, Bill.
I was reading on your campaign website. Support middle-class tax breaks. What have you heard from your constituents on the campaign trail about the recently passed tax reform that's put some money back in people's pockets? You have that. You also have the economy is doing as well as it has in several years. You got the stock market way up. So can you talk a little bit about those middle-class tax breaks you're talking about?
Well, rural America hasn't felt the economic boom yet. They're still waiting for it. And rural America, of course, is agriculture and small businesses and working families in the 9th. And that's exactly what the 9th Congressional District is. It's working families in a rural area. So they're frustrated. Many of them look at the stock market as something they hear on the news at night. They don't have a nickel in it. They're happy at the end of the month to be able to pay their bills. So we have to understand and appreciate that. So their tax breaks, there was not a lot of fairness in the tax law. When you look at the upper 1% received a $54,000 tax break, and the middle class received a few $1,000s in tax breaks. They really don't feel that. They see that in their paycheck, but boy, it isn't much money. So I think that needs to be revisited. And of course, when you get into the tax law and you start looking at it adding $1.5 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, that's a problem for me. I'm conservative. I'm fiscally conservative. And I feel that $21 trillion debt is way too much. When you start looking at what our interest payments are a year and what a large part of the federal budget that is every year, that's a problem. We have to deal with that, and we have to put in place a plan that maybe for once we'd actually have a budget instead of trying to run government on continuing resolutions. I've talked to people in federal government, in the Department of Agriculture. They said you should try to run a department on continuing resolutions. You get a little bit of money in, you're not quite sure what program to put it in, you just can't count on it. You can't put these programs in place. It makes it extremely challenging. So plenty of problems to solve down there, and unfortunately with the partisan warfare that we're seeing today, not much gets done.
Yeah, I mean you talked about the deficits, and we're at, I think, what did you say, $21 trillion, something like that. Just a few weeks ago, we added another $779 billion in fiscal 2018. I mean, how do you control the spending and offset it with cuts where you can?
Well, look, I know what it is to tighten the belt one more notch. I'm a dairy farmer, so that's been my entire life. And when I was Secretary of Agriculture, we have to have a balanced budget. So when we had rebudgeting, which happens if revenues are not up to expectation at state government, you go in and you make some adjustments, and you readjust so that you're spending within the profile of what revenues are coming in. So that certainly can happen. And I'll tell you what you don't do. You don't pass bills like the tax bill that was passed in December of last year that's going to add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. I'm not sure who did the math on that, but that's just simply adding to the federal deficit, to the federal debt. And so that's what you should not do. That's a good example of what you should not do.
It seems from hearing what I've heard Senator Mitch McConnell say of recent times that one of the things we have to do is get serious, as he put it, about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I'm not 100% sure what he means by getting serious about that, but I'm guessing it's not adding to it. I suspect he's looking to make cuts there. What's your view on whether there's a way to make that should those things ever be touched, and what could be done to help reduce the deficit, focusing on those issues?
Sure. Well, the money that goes into the Social Security Trust Fund is money that's paid in by people that are working. So that's not an entitlement program. The money that goes in there is specifically for the people that put money in, and it's for Social Security. So going forward, I think the projection right now is by the year 2034, that fund will be depleted unless we make some changes. And I feel that we should raise the cap on where the FICA tax is currently at, the Social Security tax is currently at. It's currently at around 128,000. That cap should be raised to 350,000. That would make sure that the Social Security Fund is fully funded going forward through most of this century. And then as far as Medicare goes, I have no idea why the federal government will not negotiate prices under Medicare. They do under Medicaid, they do under the VA, but Medicare does not have the authority to negotiate drug prices with drug companies. That should be put into law. That would save billions of dollars a year. That's around 33% of the drug use in the United States is through the Medicare program.
Okay. In the very many of the interviews we've had in this room over the last 3 weeks, the opioid and heroin issue has come front and center. And we had a candidate in here earlier today who said everybody thinks the problem is worse in their district than it is anywhere else, and it's awful everywhere. Has the federal government done enough to attack that issue, and do you have any thoughts on what ought to be done?
Well, the federal government has recognized the problem, and they have put federal dollars in place to help with that. Of course, that comes via grants from the federal government to the state government where it's administered. It has, certainly the medical community has recognized this problem. I was talking to a doctor a couple months ago, and he talked about how they look at pain medication that has opioids in it. It's now a second or third choice on the list. They don't just write the prescription, 7-day prescriptions. They're trying to make sure that that there is not an oversupply of opioids anywhere where someone could start playing with it and then all of a sudden find out that they have an addiction issue. So I know that the education part is important. I know the doctors are starting to tighten the prescriptions up. I know that the schools are focusing more on educating students about what a risk this is and how it can really be a fatal decision that they make. And then we have the treatment centers. The one area that really seems to be lagging is the long-term treatment, or kind of the rehabilitation after you go through detox and you're maybe in a program for 15 to 30 days. What do you do from there? How do you bring someone through that process and then reintroduce them back into society where they can have a job and lead a normal life? There seems to be some challenges and issues there and a lack of funding and facilities to help people with that.
Joe?
Yes, just to shift gears, as far as the campaign, how are you competing with your opponent as far as campaign dollars and advertising? Do you see that you're pretty even?
We've been doing well. We really don't have a handle on what our opponent's spending is. We know what the media buys are. That's public information that can be tracked and monitored. We're able to manage that and keep even with that. It takes a lot of money to run a campaign today. It's there's many aspects to it. You need good people. It's everything from getting out the vote to making sure you have the right media team to having a good strategy to put that media out there, understanding how people receive their media. So you have polling that you need to work with. So it's been a real education. I've never run for public office. I tell people it's like starting a new business. It is about putting a team in place and understanding the best way to get your message out there, and also the best way to get information from the voters in your district and understanding what's important to them. But we've walked a lot of miles and met with a lot of people. I've been in fire company breakfasts pretty much every Sunday morning somewhere in this very large district. I've been at, of course, Farm Bureau meetings and Lions clubs, and you name it. We've been there. block parties, Halloween parades. I didn't know there was so many Halloween parades, but there's a couple every day. So we've enjoyed that part of it. It's been great to get out with the people, listen to them, hear their issues, and that all becomes part of who I am and how I plan to represent them. So it's very helpful.
Well, you've never run for office before. You have certainly been involved heavily in government. Are you surprised by how uncivil things have become, and how do you react to that? And how do you go to Washington and become part of the solution?
Well, look, that's what I'm running on. I'm running on a bipartisan approach to problem solving. And when we started our campaign, we ran a positive profile ad about myself being a farmer, the things that we wanted to do going forward. And my opponent came out with his first campaign ad that attacked me in 3 mailers the first week that said things that were not true, whether I support Nancy Pelosi or I'm going to take your guns away or any one of the many things that people attack Democratic candidates for. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. They just do that. So then we responded to their ads, and pretty soon you're in a negative campaign. But this is really out of control. I had a debate with my opponent in Berks County last week, and before the debate started, I walked up on stage to shake his hand, and he pushed my hand away and he said, "You can go to hell." Now, that's a great way to start a debate. So, like you said, you are correct. This has gotten out of hand, and it's a sad day. It's something that has to change. We need some civility back in this, and that's what we have to do, and that's what I plan to do when I go to D.C. So most of my best friends are Republicans. They're people I grew up with. They're my neighbors. They're people whose opinions I respect. And I don't look at people as Republicans or Democrats. I just look at them as people. People I know that maybe have some different values than I do in terms of government in some ways. But all in all, we, in many cases, have the same values. And that's lost today. Everybody goes to their corner to the left, their corner to the right, and just throw hand grenades back and forth. Very unproductive.
Speaking of incivility, obviously we just came through the confirmation hearings of Judge Kavanaugh. I think a lot of people felt that was probably about as bad an example on both sides of government inaction, if you will. What was your perspective coming out of that, and where do we move forward from there?
Well, I think Senator Coons and Senator Flake may have been the only 2 adults in the room. I've started out with that, but certainly plenty of blame to go around. It was brought out the worst in Congress. It brought out the worst in Washington. And whether you're just looking at simply the information that was dropped in the bottom of the 9th inning that could have and should have been introduced earlier, so it went through the normal process of venting, would have kept a lot of the drama out of this. I'm just frustrated by that. It is what it is, and this is where we're at today. But it's a good example of how you shouldn't have hearings.
You're going around and going all to these Halloween parades and whatever. What are you hearing as, say, the top 1 or 2 concerns that your potential constituents have?
The partisanship that exists today, people are tired of that. They really are sick of it. The other issue that would easily float to the top would be Social Security, especially if I'm around seniors. They are very concerned about where their Social Security is at and where it's going. It is unfortunate, but it's true that a large percentage of the people in this country, that is their sole income. It's 30 to 40% of the population. That is their sole income. I talked to a lady last week. She needed dental work. She took out a loan. Wow, that's frightening. And that happens. And that's the kind of information that you learn when you sit down and talk to people. They've got real issues and real problems, and it really brings to focus that Social Security is important, and we just can't fool with that.
Bill, you talked earlier about your message and how you've learned as a political newcomer. I think everybody knows your message. I think everybody's heard "Send a Farmer to Washington" in the last few weeks. Can you talk a little bit about your experience in government? Either with the WTO Agriculture Technical Committee or your 6 years as the state agriculture secretary. What those 2 positions, how they've positioned you for a potential run here for Congress.
Well, I think my role as Secretary of Agriculture was a great lesson in bipartisanship, because my boss, Governor Rendell, is obviously a Democrat. Agriculture is about 85% Republican. So the first time I left Cameron Street and headed off to a meeting, I was meeting with people that probably hadn't voted for Governor Rendell. And that was never part of the discussion. It was all about who you are, what your problems are, and how we can develop policies to deal with those problems. And I know that sounds simple, but it's amazing how well it works. If you're open to looking at good public policy and putting partisanship to the side, I never ask anyone if they were Democrat or Republican. It was never part of the discussion. It was, what can we do for you, or what are you unhappy with? So it was a good exercise in understanding how regulations are developed, how important they are, why we need regulations, because before I was in Harrisburg, I was on the receiving end of most of those regulations. So going down there, it gave me a perspective. I had a sensitivity to how regulations can affect people. We don't want to put people out of business. Our role was to try to help them get in compliance if they weren't in compliance. So that was the spirit of what we did down there. And being Secretary of Agriculture gives you a lot of experience. It's everything from chairing the State Conservation Commission to the State Farmland Preservation Board, Animal Health and Diagnostic Commission. You had a plant industry that you were responsible for overseeing. You're on the Gaming Control Board. You're overseeing dog law. It's amazing the amount of the different parts of state government that agriculture was responsible for. So we're able to see a lot of issues, meet a lot of people, and solve a lot of problems. So I was really pleased with the opportunity to serve under Governor Rendell, and we put in place programs like Pennsylvania Preferred, that is a staple today for identifying products produced right here in Pennsylvania, as well as the Center for Dairy Excellence that has been a great resource to the dairy farmers as they struggle through about their 5th year of low milk prices.
You've twice in this conversation used the word conservative to define yourself, and you said that you probably have more Republican friends than you do Democrat friends. What makes you a Democrat?
Well, I think well, first off, I'm a Democrat because my dad and my granddad were. Now, I don't know how unusual that is, but when you grow up, it's the household you grow up in, and that's what my dad was and my granddad were. They were both Democrats. So I think, and when you're a dairy farmer, you're conservative by nature, especially fiscally conservative. I think that one of the things that when I went to Harrisburg was a great education for me was I had the opportunity to see parts of Pennsylvania I hadn't seen before. And that was the largest part of my budget, actually, was the state supplemental food program, where we made available food dollars for counties for the supplemental purchases, and that would be the food banks and the food pantries here in Pennsylvania. So that was a real eye-opener at how challenging it is for some people, how people are nutritionally at risk, how people that have families that really depend on that. So I'm socially certainly much more liberal than I am conservative. I really feel that those programs are terribly important and extremely important to people that are in need. But fiscally, I'm conservative. I think that there's two sides of the ledger. There's the income side and there's the expense side. That's the way I always ran my farm, and there has to be a correlation there. You just can't put everything on a credit card forever and hope your grandchildren are going to pay for it.
Sure seems like deficits don't matter anymore, though.
It doesn't, and they project within the next 10 years that the interest on our national debt will exceed our budget for defense.
Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Joe?
How do you, where do you stand on campaign finance reform? Do you still feel that we need it? Are there corporations or people that are allowed to donate large amounts?
Well, in the federal PACs are allowed to donate $5,000 to you. So if it's a PAC, whether it's John Deere or the National Cattlemen's Association or International Dairy Foods or some of the organizations that have supported my campaign because they're very eager and anxious to see a Congress and actually have somebody debating the farm bill that knows what a corn planter is and knows how to milk a cow and understands what the challenges of farming today in the 21st century, what they're like, and and they would like to have that voice at the table. I think some of these super PACs, I think it really gets out of control there. I think that that is where a lot of the dark money is and where a lot of the challenges come from. But I'm not sure. In my opinion, the $5,000 contributions are not that effective and make that much difference. I mean, I'm not sure how you would do it. I think if everybody was on a level playing field, count me in. I'd love to do that.
Any other questions, Terry? Anything you want to ask? Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming in and spending some time with us. We'll talk again, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.